Yeah, so I'm Grace, and as Rebecca said, I am the professional practice manager here at the British Dyslexia Association. I have done a few masters, PhD. I've also been a Senko in a primary and secondary school, and I've also got two young children as well. So I kind of know it from lots of different angles. I'm also an assessor and a specialist teacher as well. Yeah, and look forward to presenting to you. We will share the results when they're available. I don't know if they're through yet, Rebecca.
Yeah, there you go.
So I can see that there's 60% as parents, 22% as educators, and 18% as both. So great, we can see we've got a lovely mix there. So I'm just going to share my screen now. Okay. Wonderful. So I wanted to start with a quote from Atonement, and it says, "Reading is a form of telepathy. By means of inking symbols onto a page, you're able to send thoughts and feelings from your mind to the readers. It's a magical process, so commonplace that no one stops to wonder at it. Reading a sentence and understanding it are the same thing. There's no gap during which the symbols are unraveled. You see the word castle, and it's there. And for a mere 250 milliseconds, we look at each word on the screen, sweeping automatically as I just did from left to right, and near instantaneously processing these marks on the screen into sounds before transforming it into a web of interconnected meaning and memory. And that meaning is gained from a vast store of knowledge accumulated over your lifetime that you will unlock with apparent ease. So really, it does highlight that reading is a really magical process, but also something which I'm going to touch on in the presentation is this idea that reading a sentence and understanding it are the same thing. Because it's not. Word reading is a separate process to understanding what you're reading, but both are required for successful reading. And ultimately, reading comprehension or understanding what you're reading is the ultimate aim of reading. So in this presentation, we're going to look at numerous things, and you can see them on the slide here. Really, the focus and in the latter part of the presentation is looking at the components of reading. And I've done this so that you can have a more targeted support, which is the most effective and efficient way to support a child when you're reading, I believe. So first of all, what is reading? And in what amounts to only a tiny fraction of our evolutionary history, a mere few thousand years, we have developed our capacity and our ability to read. And this ability is important because it's propelled us into modernity. And this has led to previously unimaginable advances in our lives. Reading is the basis of the acquisition of knowledge, for cultural engagement, for democracy, and obviously for success in the workplace. And while many children will go on to read fluently and make rapid reading gains, for too many children, reading isn't something they gain with anything like ease. And according to the World Literacy Foundation, illiteracy costs the global economy more than $1 trillion annually in direct costs alone. And of course, the indirect costs are far greater because the failure to attain satisfactory literacy blocks people from acquiring basic knowledge, such as understanding information about hygiene, diet, safety. So consequently, low literacy in the UK and globally is a major contributor to inequality with substantial social and economic costs. And I mentioned the UK there, and just looking at the UK itself, approximately 20% of 15-year-olds don't attain a level of reading performance that allows them to participate effectively in life. And the gap in literacy attainment grows substantially during Key Stage 2, so that over 100,000 students who make the transition from primary school to secondary school are below the expected standard for reading. And I think this is quite interesting because having taught in secondary schools and primary schools, historically, teachers in secondary schools haven't had the capacity to be teaching children how to read. And teaching children to read has primarily been the responsibility of teachers in the English or the learning support department. Some cross-curricular efforts have held promise, but in most secondary schools, the challenge of literacy is greater than ever before. So let's just have a look at this in more detail. We've got a basic 2 sentences, that's all, 2 basic sentences. Joshua was caught red-handed. He was worried about what his mother would say. And we can quite easily identify 8 concepts that are required in reading these 2 simple sentences. First of all, a child would have to identify the individual words. And it's hugely challenging because it's requiring us to distinguish a word such as perhaps caught from all the numerous similar looking words it could be. And they've also got to identify words that would be unfamiliar to him. For example, Joshua, a name might be unfamiliar. Or analysing words in a more complex form, for example, worried from worry. But as I said in the introduction, words are just the building blocks of comprehension. So it's not just a matter of identifying the words, their meanings need to be activated for the right context. So we can see, of course, that the idiom caught red-handed, the child has to understand that that's that Joshua is caught in the act of doing something wrong. And also the inferences need to be made within and across the sentences. So for example, the child needs to understand that he, in the second sentence, refers to Joshua in the first sentence, which is something we do with kind of naturally, and often we forget that it needs to be taught explicitly. And of course, background knowledge is important in bringing an understanding of the concepts. And also making connections within a text and integrating information with background knowledge places demands on our working memory. Sorry, I'm not sure why that's going forward. So it places demands on our working memory, and that's quite challenging for children who struggle in this area. And there's also the only part of the task of reading comprehension is situated within the text itself. And a developed understanding comes from the interaction with the individual and their response to it, as we know as adult readers. And these diverse perspectives that we bring to tasks result in different interpretations of a text, of a text. And such differences in imagination and personal response are complex and difficult to capture at the heart of reading comprehension. So your understanding of a sentence might be different to mine. We might also infer about what the mother is like. Was she harsh or was she stern? And this can be simplified in the simple view of reading, which essentially says that reading is the product of 2 independent processes and components or parts. We've got language processes, which you can see at the top of the slide in the middle, and we've got word recognition processes. And I'll talk about this a bit later, but essentially you've got this on a going good. So they're good at recognizing words and they're not very good. And they're good at language and understanding language and not very good. And I'll show you how that works in practice. So you can perhaps see where your child is struggling and which box they might fit into so they can get the right type of support for them and they can make progress and start to enjoy reading. So we can see from this example that the child, George, is stumbling on a few words in this text. In brackets, there's somebody that's prompting him, and you can see that there's a bit of a lack of fluency when he's reading and trying to work out what the words are saying. It's still very good, but you can see he's struggling a bit to read the words. Whereas with Harry, he's clearly reading it quite fluently. He makes a little bit of a kind of break when those dots are showing there, and he needs to be prompted occasionally, but you can see these words are much better. But then when they're answered questions, for George's answers, he is quite good at making although he read it quite difficult, he was quite difficult at recognizing the words, the answers were very good to these comprehension questions that he got. So in the second column, these answers are pretty accurate. Whereas with Harry's answers, he's saying, oh, I can't remember, I'm not sure, and he's using a lot of parts directly from the text. So when we look back at that simple view of reading, we can see that Harry has good word recognition processes, but he's not understanding what he's reading. And so he is in this kind of bottom quadrant, which is on the right. Whereas George, he had poor word recognition. He was stumbling on the words, he had to be prompted. But at the end of the day, he was understanding what he was reading, and he had good comprehension when those questions were asked. So looking at dyslexia, we would say that that person was pretty much in the poor word recognition section there with George. So dyslexia is a learning difficulty that primarily affects the skills involved in accurate and fluent word reading and spelling. And it's best thought of a continuum, not as distinct category, and there are no clear cutoff points. There's also co-occurring difficulties that may be seen in aspects of language, motor coordination, mental calculation, concentration, and personal organisation. But these are by themselves not markers, by themselves, they're not dyslexia, but they're markers of dyslexia. So a good indication of severity and persistence of dyslexic difficulties can be gained by examining how the individual responds or is responding to well-founded, evidence-based interventions. And the next slide is a video giving you a bit more detail about dyslexia, which I'm going to play now. Oh.
Your brain is amazing, and nobody else has one quite like it. Although everybody's brain...
Oh. Let me try that again. I'm not sure why it's...
Your brain is amazing, and nobody else has one quite like it. Although everybody's brain looks the same, they all work differently from each other. Just as we all have different colour skin, hair, and eyes, we all have a brain that's individual to...
I think my slides are timed, which is the issue where they keep sticking forward. But that is available on the YouTube channel if you want to have a look at that video. So to give you a bit more background on dyslexia, we'll look at three different aspects because dyslexia affects three main areas of learning. Phonological awareness, so that's the understanding that spoken words are made up of sounds, and it's about recognizing how they come together to form words. Verbal memory, we can see at the bottom, is the ability to remember words and other language-based information. And it involves storing and recalling verbal information such as words, numbers, instructions, or even conversations. And verbal memory is really important for many learning tasks, such as reading, writing, speaking, and listening. And also we can see the verbal processing speed. Verbal processing speed, this describes the fluency of a verbal response to information. So the ability to verbally recall information from the long-term memory in response to visual or verbal information. And we can see here that there's no specific place in the brain that we use to read, and this is an image of the reading brain. because reading is dependent on a number of neurological circuits in the brain in different regions, different parts of the brain. So we can see that the yellow region of the brain on this image towards the back, you can see there, this just does the job of breaking down a written word into its sound. So this is about sounding out words. And this circuit influences awareness of the sounds within words. So this is our phonological awareness. And children with dyslexia have difficulties with decoding words at the phonemic or the speech sound level. So that's part of the brain there. We can also see the pink and the green regions in the brain. So they're again at the back. And this is where the brain stores the appearance and meaning of words. And this is the letter word recognition and language comprehension. And these skills are critical for more automatic, fluent reading, so that a reader can identify words without having to individually sound each word out. And then we can see the frontal lobe at the front. This allows a person to process speech sounds, so processing the sounds of speech as we listen and also speak. So it's important to remember that while these different regions in the brain, we can identify them in terms of playing certain roles in reading processes, there's multiple parts of the brain during reading that work in constant collaboration. And it's so interesting because we were never born to read, but using the circuits in the brain that existed to allow reading to take place. So it shows the incredible complexity of the reading brain, and this is kind of highlighted in the next slide. So we can see here that in the dyslexic brain, when the brain is scanned, that the speech sound is activated, but there's much lower activation for the word analysis and the letter word recognition regions of the brain, which impacts the fluency and ability to word read. And I would also mention reading comprehension. And as we saw in those responses, children are poor comprehenders, so they're not understanding what they're reading. Although they can read, they're not understanding it. They might interpret the text very literally or use snippets from the text, kind of copying the text in their answers. They might not really understand what words are meaning, so difficulty of identifying their vocabulary, and not being able to build a picture of the text and what it means as a whole. They also might get to the end of a page of reading and realize they haven't understood at all what they've been reading. And they're less good at remembering facts because they don't have that coherent model. So we're all different, and I'm dyslexic, which is why I'm so interested in supporting children and teachers and parents to help with reading, because it was very, very difficult for me to learn to read. We've all got different strengths, we've all got different challenges. And this cartoon really highlights that and acknowledges that we sometimes place quite unfair expectations on people. It also conveys the need to act and innovate and think outside the box to ensure we really get the best out of our children and our students so that children can perform to the best of their ability. So this involves practical responses. We can also think about identifying need. So you can speak to your GP if there's speech and language difficulties that you're kind of worried about and need further looking at, or visual difficulties. And also this Senko in the school, if they're not supporting already, should be a really good point of call for reading, writing and spelling difficulties. They can then refer on to, if needed, to an educational psychologist for assessment, or a specialist teacher assessor if that's appropriate. So looking at the process of reading, this is quite a kind of summary image of all those different processes, and I wanted to show it in this way to summarize it. And we're going to go through each bubble and talk about these processes and that end up in reading. So these ones in the green that start off with are really, if we think about reading as a house, and sometimes it's characterized in that way, these are the foundation stages in reading. So this active self-regulation, this is the foundation. I've put here engagement in reading, self-perception as a reader, so what the child thinks of themselves as a reader, their level of confidence in themselves, their perception of the value of reading, and also the strategies that they're using in reading. Do they see that they need to use strategies or not? So looking at this, there's some really nice images that the Love to Read project, the University of Edinburgh, have brought out. And it summarises it because I think it's a really important foundation that the child can access books I enjoy. And I know how to choose books I will enjoy. I think as parents, if we can get this right, then we're really starting on a good kind of platform with the engagement in the reading processes. And also I can access and choose books which I connect with, and I have positive reading experience, and I feel I'm developing as a reader. And there's different ways and different charities, as well as the BDA, that offer ways in which to engage children in reading. So the Book Trust has a lovely website where we can find the perfect book. So you put in the book and the themes that you enjoy and the age and the stage, and then they make suggestions about the best book to read. And also the National Literacy Trust. So this is a book club that aims to really encourage and nurture a love of reading in children and get free books to children who need them most, because about 6.5% of children in the UK say that they don't have their own book at home, which equates to 500,000 children in the UK. And as many of you all know, Marcus Rashford has supported it because he read his first book at the age of 17. And he has ensured that 100,000 books have been sent to the most disadvantaged areas. Of course, libraries and schools are a great way in which to try to engage children in reading as well. And just to remind us all, be patient, offer praise, and focus on what your child is great at, and really celebrate their smallest achievement. It's tempting to compare, but we mustn't in this journey. And the second bubble was the context. So I put here the reading diet. And this is, again, two nice summary slides that I have quality time to read and to read at home and at school. And I enjoy, sorry, it keeps going forward. I enjoy sharing and discussing my books with others. Obviously wants me to push forward. Language comprehension. So this is the bubble at the bottom. So you've got your foundations, and then you're thinking of building that house of reading. This can start at the earliest stages of a child's life through listening skills. So here we can see that developing these oral language communication skills and listening skills are so important. So tuning in, listening carefully to what is being said by the child and observing what the child is doing. Giving your whole attention, showing generous interest, eye contact, nodding and smiling. Asking the child to elaborate. So I really want to know more about that. And giving your own experience, maybe as a practitioner. So I really like to listen to music while I'm cooking at home to engage them in a conversation. Clarifying ideas through questions, just simply, so you think we should wear our coats in case it rains. Using encouragement to extend thinking. You've really thought about how you've built that tower. What could you do next? And suggesting, so you might want to try to do this. And then asking open-ended questions. So how did you? Why does this? What happens next? And this is really, really important in building these foundational skills that many of our children at the moment are finding really difficult to develop. And of course, in relation to we're reading, at the earliest ages, when spoken interactions between the reader and the child go beyond the text in the book, the more the child responds and the more that oral language skills will develop. So we can use simple open questions which encourage the child to talk about their own ideas and experiences in relation to the story. And it's through these stimulating conversations that children become inspired to engage in a story. So we can use the acronym PROMPT to encourage and remind us to prompt the child to say something about the book, evaluate their response, expand on their response by rephrasing it or adding information to it, and repeating to help them learn from their expansion. And often as parents and guardians, we would do this naturally when we're reading a book with a small child. But it just reminds us to make sure we're doing it. And examples of prompts, that first stage is again an acronym CROWD. So leaving a blank at the end of the sentence for the child to complete, asking the child something they've already read, open-ended questions, who, what, why, when, and also relating it to the child's experiences there. So there's an example on the next slide of how this works in practice, which hopefully will work. I'm going to play now.
What can you see? There's a duck, a yellow duck. A yellow duck. It's the bath. The baby's in the bath. Bath. Let's turn the page. It's the baby. The baby's eating the apple.
So that's just from the Education Endowment Foundation website, and it's quite a nice way of showing how it's quite easy, but really has a strong impact on oral language skill development, which feeds into reading and how that can start at the earliest ages. And I wanted to touch on inference now because it's something that I mentioned when we were talking about comprehension. So I've given an example here of a sentence. Molly want to get some drinks from the kitchen. She was carrying 2 glasses of juice back out to the garden. Molly should have taken off her sunglasses so she could see where she was going. She tripped on the step and stumbled. Her sister went to fetch a mop to clean the floor. And I'm going to go through 3 different inferences that a child would have to make to understand this text. An inference is where you have to read beyond the text. So in this one, they're relying on linguistic clues. In this example, it's pronoun resolution. So you have to work out which she is referring to and what her is referring to build that coherent mental model of what's happening in the text. So quite hard processes there to inference. Also in this inference that I've highlighted here, she tripped on the step and stumbled. We would have to kind of rely on our real world knowledge and interpreting that to understand that she had spilled the glass of juice. And then so generally, again, real world knowledge that the mop here is going to be cleaning up the juice that has been spilt. So this doesn't directly tell us what's happening. We're building our understanding based on our inference skills, which some children will need to be taught directly how to do for many different reasons. And within schools, teachers can look at these different skills, kind of work out where exactly the child is struggling. And word recognition, so something at the earliest stages of reading, which will be the focus. So looking at, first of all, the alphabetical principle. So the alphabetic principle is the ability to connect letters with their sounds to read and write. So for example, a child who knows that the written letter M makes the sound is demonstrating that alphabetic principle. So letters in words tell us correctly how to sound out or read and write words. And to master the alphabetical principle, readers must have phonological awareness skills and be able to recognize those individual sounds in spoken words. So learning to read and write becomes easier when sounds associated with the letters are recognized automatically. And there's two main parts in the alphabetical principle. So alphabetic understanding is knowing that words are made up of letters that represent sounds of speech. And phonological recoding is knowing how to translate the letters in printed words into the sounds they make to read and pronounce those words accurately. So in English, we know that the same letter can represent more than one sound, depending on the word. So for example, sounds different in the word mat and mate. And part of those phonological skills, as I've put here, are the isolation of sounds, the addition, the subtraction. So basically manipulating the individual sounds within words. Segmenting, so breaking down words into separate sounds, and also blending them, so merging individual sounds within a word. And it's quite nice to play with words in that way of highlighting and manipulating the sounds, so your child can get used to hearing the individual components within a word and those sounds. So word awareness is, of course, one of the first skills that children need to understand. And as I mentioned there, it can be developed by playing with sentences and sounds as well as sentences. So in a sentence, you might want to count the words, or you might want to miss out the words when you're reading the books that they might know, or perhaps get the words wrong so they can identify and feel confident that they know that word. We might want to talk about words, so how big or how small a spoken word is, and perhaps repeating those really juicy words like disastrous or ridiculous, and drawing attention to the shapes our mouths make and what our tongues and our lips do with certain words. And using our voices to also emphasize the meaning of certain words. So we might want to emphasize loud and soft and fast and slow to build those word recognition skills. So explicit phonics instruction is how the alphabetical principle works. So all 26 letters in the English language make at least one predictable or common sound, depending on the other letters in the words. And teachers can sequence and deliver instruction in a way that helps students efficiently learn those rules for the different sounds that letters and these letter combinations make. And early in reading, students can begin to read simple books that contain words that they know how to read, and using those rules of the alphabet or principle. And these decodable texts have a high percentage of words that follow some common alphabetical principle rules. So students can practice reading these books to build their confidence, to build their reading fluency, which helps them to focus their attention on understanding the meaning of the text. And we know that many common words like was, like said, like of are irregular words. And that means they don't follow the common alphabetic principle rules. So irregular words require a different teaching approach than teaching how to read rules that words that follow a rule-based letter sound structure that I mentioned before. So the most common irregular words should be taught early in reading development so that students will be able to read more expanded and interesting text than are otherwise highly decodable. And when we're teaching these skills, we would use a multisensory teaching method. So children would be able to see a picture of the letter or of the word, to maybe trace the letter in sand or in the air, to hear the sound. So we're using different methods in that multisensory teaching approach. So moving on to our next kind of component of our house here, we've looked at building language comprehension skills, which we've focused on listening skills and inference. We've looked a bit at word recognition and the different components that are involved in word recognition, decodable words and irregular words. And now we're going to focus a bit more on the bridging processes there in the middle. So this just means the processes that work for both word recognition and language comprehension to build reading together. And vocabulary knowledge, which we're going to touch on next, is really interesting. It is it's a really important, valuable, of course, and component of reading. And we find that children that know and have a good vocabulary knowledge can continue to build that vocabulary knowledge. And it's called a self-teaching hypothesis, so that they know the words, they work out the meaning of the words around the text, and they build that knowledge. And so they really develop their knowledge much quicker than children who have a poor vocabulary knowledge, who just build it very steadily, and that gap can increase. So vocabulary knowledge is really important in reading, especially as children get older in secondary schools. So I've picked this book that children might be reading in secondary schools. And at this point in the story of this book, we flash back to Edinburgh in 1878. And this is a little snippet from a dialogue between two unknown characters. So it says, "The asylum does not wish to draw attention to the boy," the tall man replied. "Such cases attract stigma, unless, of course, you wish a child's condition to become common knowledge." So if I was a teacher, I'd be saying, can this child accurately decode? Is the fluency there? But also, do they have an understanding of the words within this text? And I've highlighted asylum, stigma, condition, which may prove unfamiliar to a child reading this book. So what's the best way to develop our child's vocabulary knowledge? I would say building oral language skills is very important, but I've just highlighted kind of 4 steps which are important for educators, which you've also got on this webinar, but also can be adapted to parents as well, and how we kind of touch on vocabulary in our discussions with our children. So I've put here about tier 2 vocabulary, and this is really referring to words that are not a part of everyday language, but they're not specialist terms either. So focusing on those words that we commonly see in print is a really good way to start to build breadth and depth in vocabulary knowledge. So a teacher might say within a school, "I've got some words for you to think about here, and can you make a pair by matching the correct words with the correct definition?" And they'd be thinking specifically about those words that they've chosen because they're coming up in the text. So it's really planned vocabulary instruction. So we've got the words asylum, stigma, and condition. And then the second one, the child is using and developing the knowledge of the vocabulary within the text. So a child might say, I found the word condition within the text. It's describing something about the boy. And you discuss the word and its meaning. And then you discuss perhaps, you can use the word condition as a noun to describe the boy's state of their health, or as a verb, for example. In other sense, we could say that our choices are conditioned by our environment. So you're really developing that breadth around that particular word. And then just providing further opportunities to revisit these new words that children haven't heard before. So perhaps you're continuing to read the book as a class and you see the word stigma again. And then you can go back to it. Oh, that was one of the 3 words we looked at last time. Can you remind me of why the asylum was worried about attracting stigma from the passage that we read last time? And then finally, the child is using and applying their vocabulary knowledge. So perhaps in other subjects, they're kind of using that knowledge. So you're working cross-curricularly as well, in really making sure that vocabulary instruction is planned and not just happens. And something that children sometimes love is a different approach to words. And etymology is a study of the history of words, and this can just really unlock an interest for some children. So being able to understand where words have originated from in our language, and that can be like a hook for them into this. And it really helps us to understand and make sense of how words are built up and develop our understanding from there. So it really is about building ambitious vocabulary, and where we understood about the origins and the historical beginnings. And there's lots of apps that we can download to learn more about the history of words, story maps, tree diagrams, to help visualize the root words and the changes that are made. So for example, a maths teacher might explore the Latin prefixes and shapes and key terms, and explicitly encourage students to spot the patterns between words such as quarter and quadrilateral, triangle and triple. And also that patterns can also be across subjects. So for example, octagon in maths and octave in music. So, for example, looking at the etymology of the word salary. So this word for regular payment has some surprising links to salt, for example. So you can see this as the prefix sal, with salary coming from the Latin relating to how soldiers were paid in salt. So it's a much prized object in ancient times rather than money. And that really helps children to remember, because they've got a story connected to that word. It's much more interesting. And you can develop discussion points around it. So you might want to say, where in the world is a salt mined, going back to their, geography, for example, or the etymology of cappuccino. So cappuccino friars, and it mimics the color of their robes, and the diminutive form of cappuccino in Latin meaning hood. So it's really enhancing our engagement with words and wordplay in different ways. We might want to also bring out kind of other questions like, what are the origins of other names for food and drink? And how many words include 3 C's? Why were monks so important in the origins of our language? So we're building interest there in that way too. So coming to the end of my presentation, I just wanted to highlight further information on the BDA website. So we have a helpline that many people might be aware of, and there's also ability to email in inquiries or take direct messages through Facebook and Instagram. There's also lots of different opportunities to become a member through individual, professional, or organisational membership. And there's also the dyslexia friendly quality mark for schools and organisations. And there's also training available for parents, for assessors, for teachers as well. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and just leave time for questions if that's okay, Rebecca.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much for that, Grace. It was really insightful, and I'm sure everyone really enjoyed it. So we've got some questions coming in, and of course there's still lots of time for you to type your questions in now in the Q&A box, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. So our first question is, if dyslexia is due to poor decoding and reading at word level, are children who can read fluently but have poor comprehension not dyslexic?
Well, I don't want to give a definitive answer, because we would look at assessing an individual child to determine whether they're dyslexia or not, whether they're dyslexic or not. Obviously, if they've got fluent word reading, then that is, one difficulty of a dyslexic. But if they have poor comprehension, then the focus needs to be more on the comprehension rather than on that fluent word recognition. But yeah, an assessment would determine whether a child has dyslexia or not.
Thank you. Our next question says, I have a child aged 10 who is very aware that he struggles with reading and spelling. I've been told to work on the 300 high frequency words. Is this what you would suggest, or are there any other options?
Okay, yeah. Again, it's hard to answer. Or could you just leave that question on?
Oh, sorry.
No, that's fine, just so I can see it. It's hard to identify definitively for a particular child, but I referred to multisensory teaching approaches, which are important. The high frequency words might be something as one component to focus on within their instruction. But it depends what approaches have been tried. So, for example, phonics instruction, what has been tried there. And also, I'm always interested in what particular aspect of that phonological awareness are they struggling with, which is a good starting point. So yeah, high frequency words are part of instruction, but it shouldn't be the only way.
That's great.
Yeah.
Is there anywhere I can get dyslexia friendly books?
So Barrington Stoke offer that books that are targeted at the kind of high interest, but children that struggle with word reading, so it's an appropriate level. So that's maybe a good place to start. And yeah, I would go back to what it's good for all children is finding something that they enjoy. So those are accessible books. Sometimes what works well is that children are starting off, they can listen to it being read or being hear it as shared and paired reading. So you read a bit and then they read a bit and you read a bit. And also going to your library to discuss is a nice point if you've got one that you go to. Yeah, so I'd go for those Barrington Stoke books, maybe some paired reading, and also high interest books relevant to them.
Perfect, thank you. So this question says, at what age or stage can you notice that a child is dyslexic?
That's a really hard one. Officially, I think most people say around 7. Having said that, I really like the idea of early intervention. So I'm just talking personally about my real experience as a Senko. I was looking at children at the earliest ages to see where their difficulties were, not necessarily diagnosing them as dyslexia, but seeing how I could support them in the best way, really targeted intervention if they needed it. And it just meant that we weren't waiting for a diagnosis and we weren't kind of missing those really important years. So my personal approach was not necessarily diagnosing at early ages, but definitely providing early intervention, because evidence shows that that's the most effective way to support children.
And following on from that question, there's another one saying, at what age can dyslexia be assessed for?
Yeah, so I think I answered that. I've heard 7 is kind of what some people say. It's also dependent on the tests that we use, because the floor and ceiling effects of a test affect the accuracy of that test. But yeah, support doesn't necessarily mean that you need a diagnosis. You just need to identify the areas of difficulty.
Perfect, thank you. This person has asked, at what stage should assistive technology be used to support reading, e.g. text-to-speech software?
At what stage? I would use a hybrid approach. So I understand that it can be really engaging for a child to support those kind of foundational skills I mentioned about confidence, value as a reader. So you're getting that engagement with the appropriate technology support. But you also want them to be able to develop those skills, so not becoming wholly dependent at a very early age, if possible. So yeah, I would go for a hybrid approach with the kind of support of the school.
Great, thank you. But as primary schools don't test for dyslexia anymore, should a struggling Year 6 child wait until secondary school to see if they assess for dyslexia?
Okay, so there are so they're not assessing for dyslexia at the school. They can support though if they're not willing to assess. I always want the information. So as a Senko, I always wanted the information about where to target the support, which is assessment provided, and which I've discussed in that kind of component model. I think as a parent, I would never, if you know in your heart that the child is struggling, I wouldn't leave it. I would look at how they can be supported in their difficulty to build the skills that they'll need in secondary school. Because as I mentioned in the presentation, we go from learning to read pretty much in primary school to reading to learn in secondary school. So those skills to a certain level need to be in place for children to be able to succeed and flourish. So if they're not going to assess, then they certainly need to support in the best way.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So this person says, how do you help a child with decoding words when reading when they have very poor decoding skills? I often end up just saying the word and I'm not sure if this is helping.
Yeah, so and just going back to my own example of learning to read, the level of frustration I experienced really influenced my engagement with reading. And I needed my mum to be able to say some of the words, so I didn't hate reading. And luckily, I now really enjoy it, and I love reading. So you're doing that because you want to maintain your child's engagement. And that's what I talked about a bit about the shared reading. I think that that's perfectly fine to support in that way. And also, you know, building those fluency in the phonics skills we talked about as well is a nice way to support as well.
Great. This person says, my 8-year-old daughter has a reading age of 6 years old. Do you think she'll be able to catch up?
Oh, wow. Yes, I do, because that's what I did as a job, and I believed every child could develop the ability to read. And if we don't believe that, then, you know, it's not helpful, I don't think. So with the right targeted effective support and all the components, yes, the child will be able to catch up. But let's be realistic, I would say. I don't want to, you know, sell you a false promise, because it will take maybe a lot of time to make up that, and the progress might be small. And that's why you know, in schools, we need to use evidence-based intervention and monitor that progress, so we can see, is this working, how much progress has been made, and what do we need to do to improve it. So really working with someone who knows your child well and knows the area of difficulty will enable you to put a plan together to make that progress. And it might be gradual and steady, but progress will still be made. Yeah.
Thank you. This person has asked, how would you suggest getting better traction with school for 10-year-old child who struggles with reading, I'm just being told to get them to read more. So maybe like, how is the best way to get them to engage with reading?
For the school to engage or for the child to engage with reading?
I think for the school to engage.
Okay. Yeah, I would go into the school and just get more information about their understanding of what the child is struggling with. You can, with the kind of support of the school, have an assessment to work that out, or working with the school to work out where the areas of difficulty are. And then to work out where that child needs support. I think it goes back to that, which a few of the questions have.
Yeah.
And building their interest in reading is important, those foundational skills, but it's tricky, especially as children get older. But finding books that they enjoy is really important, and something as a parent that we can support with.
That's kind of what the next question says. It says, do you have any tips to encourage a child to engage in reading that has low self-confidence due to frustrating past experiences trying to read?
Yeah, so don't give up, absolutely, in finding a book that they enjoy. And once you get there, once you've got it, then I think it will build. But yeah, it's just finding those books that they enjoy, going to libraries to see if you can find something, and trying to give time or build it into a habit, perhaps. So there's the old classic of just before bed you read, and it's kind of a shared activity with your child, or if they're a bit older, they have time to read it in their day at home and at school. And it's built somehow into the routine of what's normal, that they see you reading, that there's kind of talk about books and there's books around, that you're enthusiastic about what you're reading, that kind of thing.
Okay, so I think this will be our last question, but I just really, because we have 53 questions open, which is an awful lot. So I just really want to encourage everyone to go to the helpline with those questions, and they will be able to signpost you, offer you advice, that kind of thing. All that information can be found on our website. So this last question says, can dyslexia be a symptom of mixing up letters, for instance, B's and D's, and numbers and letters being written the wrong way round?
Yeah, so that's something that a lot of dyslexics find difficult, myself included. I always made that silly mistake. And it's important to reflect that can, even as an adult, I do that sometimes, it can cause embarrassment, frustration, shame, all that kind of stuff. I think, the British Dyslexic Association were trying to build an environment in which, work environment, school environment, which dyslexic people can flourish and other people with neurodiversities can flourish. So yeah, that can happen, and it's obviously not the case for every dyslexic. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Grace, for this evening, and thank you so much for everyone attended. I think it's been really insightful and educational, and I really hope everyone enjoyed it. We have one final Dyslexia Awareness Week special webinar tomorrow evening, specifically for teachers and educators at 7 o'clock. So if you're interested in that, please make sure you register online ahead of tomorrow. And thank you everyone for attending. Good night, even.
Thank you. Bye.